Let's go straight to the Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister, Simon Birmingham. Thanks for your time, Senator. First of all, we've seen Joe Biden in the last hour or so with two significant developments. First of all, retaliatory strikes have been apparently approved by Joe Biden against Iran for that drone strike, but it is also imposing sanctions on settlers in the West Bank.
Well, LJ, certainly what we're seeing is consistency there from Joe Biden in relation to addressing the threat of terrorism, the threat posed by Iran and the many different operatives, tragically, that Iran sponsors, be that the sponsorship of Hamas, who of course were the instigators of the October 7 terrorist attacks, their sponsorship of Hezbollah, their sponsorship of the Houthi rebels who are causing such disruption in the Red Sea. So a range of different areas in which the type of actions of Iran, the need to see those who promote extremism, terrorism, and those who support them to be tackled head on. Of course, it's also important to make sure that we are consistent, that we have expectations of all of our partners, allies and friends, and those expectations include upholding rule of law, and that is an important thing for the way in which Israel operates in relation to the West Bank, and that is a factor that Joe Biden is obviously looking at in relation to those decisions that he's pursuing there.
Is that something that you would support? Essentially, it's a signal from the United States that essentially Israel's biggest ally is not going to tolerate that kind of retaliatory violence in the West Bank.
Well, we should all have expectations in relation to seeing the rule of law upheld amongst our democratic partners, allies and friends. We have a long-standing bipartisan position in Australia of wishing to see a negotiated settlement, two-state settlement to the issues between Israelis and Palestinian peoples. Now, whether it is ultimately a two-state solution or some other negotiated settlement, these matters are ultimately to be subject of negotiation. But there should be a rule of law applied and applied equally to all in relation to how people's rights and liberties are protected and ensuring that that is something we expect consistently of anybody.
Is a two-state solution really viable at this point?
Well, I think we have to recognise there are many steps to be undertaken before we could see that as a viable outcome. And it may be that other viable outcomes can be contemplated or negotiated. Now, the fundamental thing that needs to be achieved first and foremost is security. It is not going to be viable to see any of the steps taken if Israel continues to live with the threat of terrorist attacks like those Hamas undertook on October 7. And that's why it is important that we retain the resolve to see Hamas disabled and removed from a position of power and influence, to create the type of security environment in which then other aspirations can be achieved. The aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians alike are to live peacefully and to have legitimate aspirations in terms of that peaceful coexistence.
It sounds like we're a long way away from that peaceful coexistence at the moment. I want to focus on Gaza now and UNRWA. This is the body that countries like Australia and the United States, the UK, just to name a few, has decided to pause funding for. This is after it was found that about 13 of its 13,000 employees were perhaps directly involved in those October 7 attacks. But what it has meant is that it might be limiting further aid getting into Gaza. How do you navigate that one?
Concerns about UNRWA have existed for quite some time. Indeed, they've been expressed prior to the October 7 attacks in relation to whether UNRWA employees have promoted extremist ideologies that have fostered the type of environment that saw Hamas rise and the type of terrorist attacks undertaken. And of course, concerns were raised with the Albanese government late last year, even as they were increasing funding to UNRWA, about whether employees had been directly involved in those October 7 terrorist attacks. So these are incredibly serious matters. Now, there is no denying that there is huge human suffering and need for innocent civilians to get humanitarian assistance and support in Gaza. But not a dollar of Australian taxpayers' money should be filtering through an organisation where it could be not getting to those who need it, but instead be landing in the hands of those who are promoting extremism and undertaking terrorist attacks. So ideally, you would see funding delivered through other means, other agencies, be it international organisations like the Red Cross, UNICEF or others, or finding alternate structures that the UN should consider and put in place as a replacement to UNRWA to ensure that all donor countries can have confidence support gets there. As a country, as Australia, we shouldn't be acting in ways that are contrary at all to other significant partners, especially those like the United States. Right. I would expect that any resumption of funding would be consistent with the types of approach of the US and other key partners and would have absolute rock-solid safeguards in place so every Australian can know their taxpayer dollars are going to those who need and deserve it, not potentially being filtered off to the promotion of extremism or terrorism.